זקן. אני עוד עובד בשיטות ישנות.
זהו, מי מדפיס היום?
No doubt.
הנה זה עובד. דולה?
We've been blaming the architect for a long time. What can you think is this?
All these sophisticated people. מה?
רוצה שזה יפה,
טוב, צהריים טובים לכולכם. אני לא נועם. אז אני שמחה שבאתם, ותודה לדוקטור כוכבי שאפשר לנו לעשות את האירוע הזה במסגרת הקורס שלו. אני יודעת שכולנו ככה, לא, אני אדבר בשם עצמי. כאילו, אני אתמול באמת לא הייתי עסוקה בעניינים של טראמפ וסדר בינלאומי, ויותר באמת במקום הפרטי שלנו. אבל בכל זאת, זה האירוע השלישי למעשה של אקטואליה שאנחנו עושים הסמסטר, ככה דרך מכון דייוויס. והיום דווקא רצינו לצאת החוצה, וחיכינו בכוונה ל-20 בינואר כדי שיהיה לנו משהו סמלי ויפה. ובכל זאת, לא כל יום נכנס לבית הלבן נשיא חדש, ובטח לא כשהנשיא הזה הוא דונלד טראמפ. הדבר השני שמאוד מרגש באירוע הזה, שאנחנו באמת משתפים פעולה, גם המחלקה למדע המדינה וגם המחלקה ליחסים בינלאומיים, כי קשה מאוד באמת לחשוב על ארצות הברית ולאן אנחנו הולכים, בלי להבין את הזירה הפנימית והבינלאומית. ולכן בשלב הזה, ברשותכם, אני אעבור לאנגלית כדי להקל על שני המשתתפים שלנו, שמייצגים כנראה לא את דונלד טראמפ, אבל את ארצות הברית של אמריקה, the great USA. So I'm happy to open this panel on trying to make sense of a new president in the White House, domestic and international dimensions. We have 5 participants here. My name is Galia Presbarnathan. I'm from the International Relations Department. And I'm the director of the Davis Institute. And we have 2 domestic perspectives today that will be offered by Dr. Charlie Lesh from the Political Science Department and by Dr. Matthew Simonson.
Simonson.
It is Simonson. Okay. It's good I said it out loud once, so I will. Okay. Matthew Simonson. Thank you. Shnei Yudim. Okay. I knew we should have done this in Hebrew. Also from the Political Science Department, who are going to offer 2 different domestic sort of takes on what is happening. And then we're switching to the international perspective, and we're going to have with us Dr. Noam Kochavi, whom most of you know, to talk about whether Trump is really that special. Then I'll try to say something about Trump and the international order, as big as it gets. And then we'll conclude with Dr. Daniel Weiner, whom many of you probably know, who will give us a different perspective about populism, Trump, and also international order from a different perspective. So the way we planned this was to do a 12 minutes short presentation each, and hopefully then we will have half an hour, 25 minutes or so for a discussion, for your questions. And you can ask in English, you can ask in Hebrew. We'll figure it out when we get there. Okay. So we have a plan. We're waiting for the inauguration, and until then, we can say whatever we want. So Charlie, we'll start with you.
Should I sit over there?
You see, I have your slides on. So I can be your,
You'll be the
Wheel of Fortune
okay.
person.
I'm not really a PowerPoint person. I'll by thanking Talia for organizing this timely panel and for the kind invitation.
Yeah. You just want
to
this
speak.
sort of,
Oh, sure.
yeah. Just
Somewhere around. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
somewhere around.
All right. So I've got the pointer and I've got this. All right. I'll find a way to make it work. So I can't claim to be an expert on American politics, but Matthew and I this year are teaching a class on American political thought and behavior. And as the political theorist here, what I'm going to try to do with my time today is just say a word about what I think this election reveals about recent ideological developments on the American right, and then just try to briefly put some of those developments in historical and philosophical perspective. And my takeaway, put briefly, is this, that I think there is actually potentially quite a radical change taking place within conservative thought in America right now. And for those of us, both here in Israel or in the United States, who are broadly committed to liberal democracy, I think there's reason why this transformation should be a cause for concern in various ways. So with that somewhat dramatic opening, where I'd like to begin today, maybe surprisingly, is actually not with Donald Trump. And that's for a couple of reasons. Most plainly, this is going to be Trump's last term in office, presumably. Maybe not according to him, we'll see. It won't be long until he's no longer going to be the loudest voice on the American right. Moreover, although Trump does, of course, have political views and policy preferences, I don't think that it can really be said that he's ideologically driven, at least not in a conventional way. So he's certainly not bound by any kind of school of thought or political philosophy. So when we want to see where American conservatism is headed, I think it makes more sense not to look to Trump himself, but instead to his vice president, J.D. Vance. All right. Now, a lot can be said about Vance from his writings and his speeches and his background, and many others have written about the constellation of influences out of which his thought emerges. Suffice it to say, though, Vance, in contrast to Trump, really is a thinker who engages with political philosophy as well as with theology. He takes ideas seriously, or as seriously as you might expect from a politician. And I think it's fair to say that Vance's worldview, kind of put aside practical political considerations, emerges out of that kind of thought. So to get at what that worldview entails, I want to take a look at just one brief excerpt from the speech that Vance gave at the Republican National Convention when he became his party's nominee. This is, again, just a little bit of what he said at that speech. All right. One of the things that you hear people say sometimes is that America is an idea. And to be clear, America was indeed founded on brilliant ideas like the rule of law and religious liberty, things written into the fabric of our Constitution and our nation. But America is not just an idea. It is a group of people with a shared history and a common future. It is, in short, a nation. Okay. Now, at first glance, you might say, okay, there's not anything so noteworthy here. If you were kind of reading or listening to these lines in isolation, you might say, okay, Vance is just parroting some fairly standard, even banal platitudes about American democracy and identity. But for those who followed Vance's ideological development over time, those who are familiar with his intellectual circle, I think it's clear he's actually doing something here which is far more significant. And to get at that, I want to focus here on two main elements that we can see in these lines. So first, the notion that America is primarily an idea. And then second, the notion presented seemingly as an alternative, that America should instead be seen first and foremost as a nation. What I want to suggest is that Vance here is identifying with an increasingly popular line of thought in right-wing circles, both in America and also around the world, including in Israel, that wants to elevate the latter over the former. In other words, this is a line of thought that wants to put the nation or nationalism over foundational normative ideas, especially liberal democratic ideas. So by this view, the nation comes first, ideas exists primarily to serve it and its interests, not the other way around. All right. So looking a little more closely now, I want to suggest there are really two dimensions to this kind of new right-wing nationalism. One of these is negative, that is to say, it's a kind of critique of previous iterations of conservative thought. And the other is constructive or positive in the sense that it provides a new ideological vision. So to take the first of these, the more negative dimension, this critique of liberalism. I should say, by liberalism here, what I'm referring to is not the contemporary American left or just the contemporary American left, but rather the much broader philosophical school originating in the 18th and 19th centuries. Liberalism, by this definition, is concerned, as the name implies, with liberty. It's oriented around individual rights and personal freedom, limitations on state power. Over time, liberal ideas have, of course, been interpreted in various ways across the ideological spectrum, from more egalitarian and progressive forms on the left to more libertarian or so-called classical conservative, classical liberal forms on the right, as well as centrist or synthetic forms like neoliberalism. But it's noteworthy that the United States, arguably since the end of the Civil War, and I think certainly since the end of the Second World War, has largely converged around its acceptance of liberalism in this broad definition. That is to say, America has been governed by a kind of consensus liberalism. There's been ideological disagreement, of course, and Americans have certainly differed about policy, but such disagreements have almost always taken place within the tent of liberalism, not in distinction with Europe, for instance, between liberalism and, say, communism, or socialism, or classical conservatism. So Americans in this way have shared a kind of common governing philosophy, and to a great extent a common language also for articulating their political ideals. So what is the language of this consensus liberalism? In political philosophy, liberalism can be traced back to Locke and Kant and Mill and many others. In actual politics, American liberal discourse, certainly since the Civil War, has been indebted above all to the US Declaration of Independence. So in the interest of elucidating that discourse at least a little bit today, allow me to read just a brief excerpt from the US Declaration of Independence. It's one that I imagine many of you are familiar with, and I'll try to do the rhetoric justice. I'm sure I won't be able to, but okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter, to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay. Now, there's obviously a lot that can be said about these lines. What I want to do right now is just spotlight three concepts that we can see, I think, embedded within the Declaration, as part of the Declaration. And by doing that, what I want to do is elicit some of the core features of liberalism in America, and especially this notion that Vance referred to of America as an idea. What does he mean by that? Okay. So the first of these concepts that I want to spotlight here is universalism. The Declaration's immediate aim, of course, was to accomplish a divorce from the United Kingdom and then explain the reasons, right, for why it is splitting off, but very intentionally couches its assertion of independence in universal human terms, right? It begins by invoking not the immediate history of the American colonists, but self-evident truths. These are truths, in other words, that are accessible in principle to all people through reason. And that is so, the Declaration suggests further, and critically, because all human beings are equal. Right? They are all equally and uniformly, they all bear the stamp of a single creator, right, who endowed them with the same dignity, the same moral worth. Okay, so that's point number one. A second concept that we can see in the Declaration, after universalism, is individualism, by which I mean here a kind of normative valorization of the individual. So in articulating the moral status of people, the Declaration doesn't bind that status to a person's membership in a particular human community. Instead, each person receives this status as an individual. That is to say, in isolation from and prior to any kind of membership in any association or something like a nation, for instance. More concretely, each person is endowed with unalienable rights. They are entitled, nearly as an individual, regardless of their history or identity or nationality, to their life, liberty, and ability to pursue happiness. Okay, the final concept in the Declaration that I want to spotlight here is government by consent. The role of the state, according to the Declaration, is both defined and limited by these two prior concepts of universalism and individualism. So the purpose of government isn't to advance the narrowly defined interests of a single person, like a king, or a class, like an aristocracy, or a group, like an ethnic group, nor are governments erected to teach people how to be morally virtuous or how to be religiously faithful, according to some theology or some concept of the good. Governments exist, for the Declaration, for a limited purpose: to express and defend the rights of individuals, to safeguard their lives, and allow them to pursue happiness as they define it. Okay, now with this in mind, I want us to turn back to Vance and to his speech. And what I want to suggest is it's really these ideas from the Declaration, above all, that Vance is referring to when he refers to this notion of America as an idea. He calls America an idea. And I should say it's really remarkable the extent to which these notions of universalism and individualism, government by consent, this American idea were reflected in American political thought over the next couple centuries. To offer just a few prominent examples, so Abraham Lincoln, who led the United States through the Civil War, referred to the principles of the Declaration as, quote, the definitions and axioms of a free society. He commented that, quote, he had never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in it. Okay. The black abolitionist and great statesman Frederick Douglass referred to the Declaration as the, quote, ring bolt in the chain of American destiny. In other words, Douglass saw the text not only as kind of backward-looking, right, but actually forward-looking toward its future aspirations, what America should strive for in the future. More recently, both egalitarian American philosophers like John Rawls and libertarian thinkers like Milton Friedman have echoed the Declaration's ideas in different ways, and so have presidents who are as ideologically as opposed to one another as Ronald Reagan, say, and Barack Obama. Okay. So in light of that, what makes the kind of conservative thought that Vance represents so radical, I think, is that it really abandons, I think, this kind of consensus liberalism. At the very least, it seeks to move past it. It really rejects the notion of America as an idea. And indeed, you might have noticed, I can go back to the first slide, you might have noticed that Vance in his speech does this in a kind of subtle way. So rather than kind of loudly coming out and saying, America is not an idea, which would certainly make headlines, he just kind of quietly downgrades it, right? He takes this notion, America is an idea, usually capital I, single concept, and he renders it in the lowercase and the plural as particular, far more concrete ideas, right? So now, of course, there's no doubt that the rule of law and religious liberty are very important American ideas, but I think it's equally clear that these are not the broader principles that we find in the Declaration. And I think this is, in fact, very intentional by Vance. In fact, I'll go a little further, that if you start to look at the thinkers who exercise the strongest influence on Vance, you will find almost a uniform convergence on their rejection of precisely those concepts that we found in the Declaration. In other words, these are people who criticize principles of universalism and individualism and government by consent. They're people who oppose consensus liberalism, as I've defined it. So I know I'm almost out of time here, but I just want to, in concluding, just ask, so what do these thinkers in advance themselves actually want to replace liberalism with? Right, so this is the big question. Now, I'm reluctant to generalize too much here, because there are, in fact, important differences among those who are in Vance's intellectual orbit. Even so, I think it's possible to identify two main strands of thought, which are especially influential. The first of these is Catholic integralism. This is a form of traditionalist Catholic thought which proposes a kind of integration of church and state. It advocates the use of legal coercion to cultivate faith and deepen moral virtue, as its proponents define it, of course. The second of these strands of thought is a kind of right-wing nationalism, as, for example, that articulated by, among others, Israel's own Yoram Hazony, a strong influence on Vance. We already saw evidence for nationalism's influence where he calls America a nation, right? But before ending today, I just want to note one other place in his speech where this comes across, I think, even more strongly. Okay, so this is a little bit further on in the speech. And here, Vance is talking about his family's traditional cemetery. Okay? It's a place that he recounts there's 7 generations of Vances have been buried in this place. And this is what he comments about. The Vance says, 7 generations of people who fought for this country, who built this country, who've made things in this country, and who would fight and die to protect this country if they were asked to. Now, that's not just an idea, my friends. That's not just a set of principles. Even though the ideas and the principles are great, that is a homeland. That is our homeland. People will not fight for abstractions, but they will fight for their home. And if this movement of ours is going to succeed, and if this country is going to thrive, our leaders have to remember that America is a nation and its citizens deserve leaders who put its interests first. Okay, so I think we can see here quite clearly how this form of conservative thought departs in important ways from consensus liberalism. American identity, according to this kind of right nationalist view, is not universal. It is particular. It is rooted quite vividly in blood and soil, the blood of 7 generations and the soil of a graveyard. Right? Moreover, American identity for Vance is not individualistic but communitarian. Americans might have certain rights, but they are first and foremost members of a larger collective, members of a nation. And then finally, government here exists not primarily for the service of the governed and based on their consent, but to serve this larger collective, the national interest. Individual freedoms in this way are kind of secondary. The nation comes first. Okay, now, how and to what degree these ideological transformations will actually be borne out over the next 4 years, of course, very hard to say. But just in concluding, I want to reiterate what I said at the very beginning, that for those of us who are committed to America's consensus liberalism or to liberal democracy more generally, I think there's real cause to be concerned about the current direction of the American right intellectually. Trump might be leaving office in 4 years, but I think these ideas, or some of them, are likely here to stay. I'll stop here. I look forward to your questions.
Okay.
Matt. Do you want a clicker also?
Sure, I like this. Let's see if I can sense. Yes. All right, so I'm going to talk today about who voted for Trump and then what policies we can expect as a result. So let's start a little bit with general voting patterns in this election. Who voted for Trump? Republicans. Republican-leaning independents. In fact, a lot of people who classify themselves as independent in the United States it's really more of a branding. Americans want to think of themselves as independent thinkers and not going with the trend and not just being a bunch of sheeple. We want to be seen as like having our own thoughts. But then when you ask a self-labeled independent who they voted for the past 5 elections, they can say, oh, well, the Republican every time or the Democrat every time. In the class this morning, I compared this to the Dati Leumi as a political brand in Israel, that there are people who identify as secular or as Haredi who still call themselves Dati Leumi because it's a nice label. It's very in. It's a fashionable trend. So being independent might still mean that you're consistently Republican or Democrat. Social and fiscal conservatives, people who feel that the government should be doing less and that we should have fewer regulations of business, fewer laws about constraining labor and the environment so that businesses are free to do what they want, lower taxes, and we should be following traditional Christian values, banning abortion, not promoting a trans LGBTQ agenda. And rural Americans, less educated Americans, white Americans, but not by a huge gap, and men, but not by a huge gap. So these are the bases of support that Trump had for the last 2 elections. And in general, which Republicans have had as their base for a couple decades now, with the exception of the education divide, has increasingly been growing. Now, what shifted towards Trump this election? What pushed him over the edge? So Hispanic Americans, particularly male Latinos as opposed to Latinas, moved toward Trump. Younger Americans and first-time voters, urban Americans, and let's just take a look at the election map. So this is from, I think Al Jazeera made this nice map of which way each state moved in the most recent election. So a red arrow up to the right means the state moved toward Republicans toward the right, and a blue arrow up and toward the left means they moved up and toward the left. Now it's hard to see the blue arrows, but it's actually because there are none. Every state, both the blue states and the red states, moved toward Trump this election. So I guess that's good, right? The country didn't get more polarized, it just moved more toward the right everywhere. And so which states flipped? So there were a number of these so-called swing states. Remember, in the US, we vote a little bit differently than Israel. We vote by state, and if you get a majority in Michigan, then all the votes from Michigan go to you. If you get a majority in North Carolina, even if it's by 1 vote, all the votes in North Carolina go for you. So it'd be as if in Israel, like, winning Tel Aviv, even if you won by 1 vote, all of a sudden, all the people who are, right-wing in Tel Aviv, the votes don't count, and then, if you win the majority in Bet Shemesh, all the liberals who are in Bet Shemesh don't get counted, right? So if you are a Republican in a very blue state or a Democrat in a very red state, your vote has no impact. And so it comes down to the states that are almost 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. And you can see in general that the coastal liberal elites, as they're derided, are the Democrats, and the heartland, the middle of the country, the big square states that are big and square because they're very rural and sparsely populated, those tend to be more Republican. And so you had some flips around the margins. You had some of these states in the Midwest, Michigan and Pennsylvania, flipping from blue to red. But most of the country looked about the same. So it was not a major electoral realignment. The same states that flipped to Trump this time had flipped to the Democrats in the previous election. So we don't see a major change in the map. And then when we look, I don't know if we can hit the lights. Is there the front row lights. Okay, so we can look at a few of these swing states and see what changed. So this is Michigan. And we see here in Michigan that in 2016, the 18 to 29-year-olds leaned Democrat by about 23 percentage points. It was the same in 2020, and now they lean Republican in Michigan by 3 percentage points. Hispanics and Latinos started out being 21 percentage points in favor. So, but I'd say the 21 percentage point gap would mean 60 to 39, right? Like it's the gap between the 2 percentages. So Hispanics and Latinos leaned toward toward Democrats in 2016. They moved somewhat toward Trump in 2020, and now majorly toward Trump this election. So it went from being 21 points in favor of Democrats to 21 points in favor of Republicans. So it's like going from 60-40 to 40-60. National trends mimic the swing state trends. So let's see that there's been an urban shift toward Trump. Urban areas, as I said, are still the Democratic strongholds. But you have Trump gaining 8 percentage points in urban areas and making smaller gains in the rural areas that he already has a lot of support in. But actually, this is illusory because when we break it down by race, we see that's kind of the same across. If you look at white majority counties, the gains were actually kind of the same across. You have about 3.6 to 4.4, and if you look at just the, I should scroll down, the majority non-white counties, just slightly bigger gains in urban areas, but about the same across these. So and again, if you look at particular counties, the counties that are most diverse, the Bronx, Queens, both parts of New York, Miami, Hudson County, New Jersey, Brooklyn, Los Angeles. So the urban counties that are most racially diverse were the ones that moved the most toward Trump. And the ones that are least racially diverse, that were only 20% non-white, 30% non-white, were the ones that moved the least toward Trump. So there was a urban shift toward Trump, but it was largely just a function of the fact that Hispanic and to some extent Asian and black people in general were moving toward Trump, and they tend to live more in urban areas than rural areas. So gender divide deepened somewhat, not dramatically. So as I said, there is a gender divide already. So in the 2020 election, 45% of men voted for Biden and Harris. And in this election, 44. So the Democrats lost 1% among men. And in the previous election, 57% of women voted for Biden and Harris. And this time, 54% did. So in fact, because both men and women shifted toward Trump, the gap may shrunk a little bit in some ways. So there is a gender gap, but it's not a huge gender gap. It's 44 to 54, 10% difference. It's not like all men in America vote for Trump, all women vote for Harris. But the gap changed a little bit. Then we have the big swings among Asian and Hispanic voters. So if we look at the, get down to the line with Hispanics and Latinos. So in 2020, 32% of Hispanics and Latinos voted for Trump, and this election, 45% did. So again, most Hispanic and Latino voters in America are still voting for Democrats, but the gain was huge, going from about a third to almost half supporting Republicans. So that was the big story of this election. There also was a shift among Asian Americans, but Asian Americans are about 4% of the population. Hispanic Americans are about 15%, so it has a smaller electoral impact. Youth shifted away from Harris toward Trump. So this is the youngest age group, and we see that in the 2020 election, 60% of the youngest age group voted for Democrats. In this election, 55 did, so they lost 5%, and Trump gained 6% among youngest Americans. So young Americans, hard to say if it's a long-term trend of becoming more right-wing. As you can see, in general, a majority of young people are still voting for Democrats, but they lost ground. So the story overall demographically is there was no big major realignment in America, but the groups that Democrats were strongest in, minority voters and young voters, became less strong for them. So still a majority of Hispanics and black people and young people for Democrats, but it's not an overwhelming majority anymore, it's a smaller majority, and that was enough in some cases to help tip these states that were very close to 50-50 from Democrats to Republicans. First-time voters seem to also largely come out for Trump. So in the last election, in 2020, 64% of first-time voters voted blue, and in this election, 45% of first-time voters voted blue. Last election, 32% of first-time voters went for Trump. This time, 54% of first-time voters went for Trump. So it's a combination of young people voting for Trump and people who weren't so motivated before but now got interested in politics or interested in saving the country as they see it, going for Trump. And lastly, the education divide increased a bit. So we had in 2020, the gap among people who never went to college, we see that 54% went for Republicans, and this time 62% of those who never went to college went for Republicans. So existing gaps deepened, but no major realignment. So now let's talk about what issues were important. So if you ask people a top issue in the election, the most of them say the economy or the state of democracy. Sorry for those of you who think that Israel drives American voting patterns. Only 4% of them said foreign policy, and that includes Ukraine and everything in China and Russia. Immigration and abortion were the other two big partisan issues. And if you ask people what was most important to them, among swing voters, inflation and prices are the big drivers. So unemployment was quite low, but because there was such big inflation in the first couple of years, stuff costs a lot more than it used to, and people's salaries have not gone up to match that. So the economy is the most important issue for most voters. The war between Israel and Hamas is down there at the bottom. 26% think that's one of the most important issues, whereas 79% say it's the economy. Healthcare, crime, immigration, abortion are the other ones. I'll skip through a couple of these, but what was the election about overall? Trump as the anti-establishment change candidate. Everyone agrees Trump is disruptive, that he's different, that he's weird, and people wanted that. People saw Biden and Harris as business as usual, and they felt like the country wasn't going the way they wanted it to. They felt like things were too expensive, crime was up, and there were immigrants coming to take their jobs, destroy their culture, whatever reason they had. Immigration was seen as a big threat. Resentment against elites, and an anti-progressive backlash against BLM, against restrictive COVID policies, against lighter policing, which people blame for rising crime, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies at companies and schools, and promotion of trans rights. All of these led to backlash, especially when it came to education, immigration and crime fears, and feeling that your purchasing power, your ability to buy stuff, had not been restored, even if unemployment was down. So these were the big issues driving the election, and as a result, what we can expect, basically a typical Republican domestic agenda with an extra dose of nativism. So what do I mean by that? So nativism, deportation of unauthorized immigrants. So this is the iconic image of the family separation policy from Trump's first term in office, a little girl at the Mexican border being separated by her parents, being sent to basically a temporary orphanage while her parents are sent to jail. This was the most controversial policy of Trump's first administration. And it's a chance it could come back, separating parents from their children at the border as a way to discourage them from sneaking across the border. A rise in tariffs, and it's unclear what Trump's policies are on legal immigration, because he does have a lot of allies in industry who favor having more highly skilled workers for jobs. So most of his rhetoric has been against illegal immigrants being drug dealers and criminals, but he's softer and perhaps even encouraging of getting highly educated, high-skilled workers to come legally. A war in the civil service, his desire to dismantle the government through Elon Musk, who's going to have his own Department of Government Efficiency. Politicization of civil service positions, making more long-term bureaucrats political appointees. And then trying to drive people out of government by moving offices from my hometown of D.C. to Kansas, where no one really wants to live. Curtailing the ability of these agencies to regulate. A general anti-progressive agenda of trying to roll back trans-friendly policies, rolling back DEI. Perhaps there's some talk of removing female soldiers from combat roles, and perhaps an effort to fight liberal causes on college campuses by denying colleges funding. And lastly, a general pro-business anti-regulation policy of fewer climate change regulation, deregulation of AI and tech, tax cuts and a generally less progressive tax code. So in conclusion, it's the economy stupid is the sort of truism of American politics. It's Tip O'Neill said in the 80s that the economy drives us more than anything else, and it seems to be the case here. No major realignment except among Hispanics. It's been driven largely by the existing Republican-Democratic debates that we've been seeing for decades. Immigration and trade are kind of the newly partisan issues, but even these have been around for all three Trump elections. And we should expect largely traditional Republican policies of small government, lower taxes, and push back against progressive cultural trends. Thank you.
The first 100 days.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we know what's happening inside, I think NOM is the right transition between the domestic and the international.
It's interesting and not surprising that we haven't coordinated our talks beforehand, but you will now see that things align. How singular, my title is How Singular is Trump's Foreign Policy Record in Historical Perspective? How to approach a phenomenon as outside normal boundaries as Trump. In accordance with both my training and personal preference, I have chosen to look back at the historical foreign policy record and try to assess just how singular was the first Trump administration within the larger foreign policy tapestry. Undeniably, Trump both contradicted and undermined the most basic multilateral pillars of global American hegemony established under Truman, including standing up to expansionist dictatorships through institutions of mutual collective security, an international economic system combining considerable federal engagement with a commitment to institutions of free trade, and a productive collaboration in the making of foreign policy between the White House, Congress, the State Department, and the intelligence community. Yet, a more careful analysis reveals a measure of continuity with the past, especially regarding the considerable effect of American historical exceptionalism, namely, a sense that Americans have both the duty and the right to dispense with the past and restart the history of humanity all over again. Echoes of the more distant past in this vein abound. Let us point them out chronologically. First, although the Founding Fathers cautioned against Trump-like phenomena by agreeing that a demagogue constitutes the largest threat to the Republic, in the realm of foreign policy, George Washington foreshadowed Trump's orientation by famously admonishing the American people to avoid foreign entanglements and steer clear of permanent alliances. Second, the populist dimension in Trump's foreign policy disposition finds an antecedent with America's first populist president, Andrew Jackson. Jacksonian nationalist populism was only intermittently concerned with foreign policy. Jacksonians have certainly been preoccupied, however, with the key determinant of an exceptionalist foreign policy, the general mission of the US in the world. Many Americans with cosmopolitan sympathies see their main ethical imperative as working for the betterment of humanity in general. Jacksonians, on the other hand, locate their moral community closer to home in fellow non-immigrant citizens who share a common nationalist bond. If the cosmopolitans see Jacksonians as backward and chauvinistic, Jacksonians return the favor by seeing the cosmopolitan elite as near treasonous, people who think it morally questionable to put their own country and its non-immigrant citizens first. Third, the Republicans' successful objection to both Versailles and participation in the League of Nations sprang not so much from an isolationist impulse, but rather from insisting that America's intervention in the world affairs must be conducted unilaterally, strictly on Washington's terms. Fourth, Charles Lindbergh's powerful America First movement resembles Trump's not only by name. Both have been rooted politically in rural America, reflected a surge of nationalist isolationism, catered to dictators, and have been tinged with racist and anti-immigrant overtones. Of equal importance are the similarities between Trump and two more recent presidencies, Nixon's and Bush Jr.'s. The points of overlap in Nixon's case are plentiful. Nixon rose to power when the country was torn apart and anguished by outbursts of violence. He capitalized on Americans' fundamental distrust of the system and won on a law and order ticket. He accommodated right-wing dictators, particularly in Latin America. His administration quarreled with Western Europe over succumbing to the Arabs' oil weapon and was at odds with Japan over trade practices and Japan's refusal to shoulder more of the security burden. Nixon's deep anti-elitist bent found a striking expression in his instruction to Kissinger, as my students know, quote, "Write it in 100 times. The press is the enemy. The professors are the enemy," unquote. Both Nixon and Kissinger took pleasure in marginalizing the State Department in general and Foreign Service officers in particular. Nixon sought to coerce diplomatic counterparts through cultivating an image of personal irrationality, a strategy, as we all know, Trump has employed regularly. Moreover, in the Arab-Israeli context, Nixon and Kissinger advanced agreements premised on shelving the Palestinian problem, as did Trump and his team with the Abraham Accords. Finally, among complaints about Nixon's imperial presidency, Congress sought to curb presidential power, establishing committees investigating abuses of power, a parallel to the January 6th committee and two impeachments under Trump. As for Bush Jr., his administration was similar to Trump's in embracing unilateralism enthusiastically and explicitly, insisting the administration knows best what the world needs, regardless of what other nations want. Much like Trump first, Bush Jr.'s administration reserved special rancor for Western Europe, decreeing old Europe for timidity and declaring that America's mission in the world would neither be determined nor constrained by a coalition with ungrateful European members. The relationship ebbed to such an extent that contemporary pundits spoke confidently about an irreparable Atlantic divorce. When the relationship surprisingly recovered under Obama, it became clear that the strains during the Bush Jr. era were due to two causes that reappeared under Trump. First, an American president who personifies the stereotype of Americans that West Europeans love to hate, namely ignorant, vulgar, and condescending. And the second, West Europe is too weak to lead, yet too proud to be led, protesting against a failure to consult on Washington's part. Finally, Bush foreshadows Trump in sidelining the State Department and in not bothering to read the CIA's daily brief up until 9/11. To be sure, Bush did differ from Trump in his willingness to admit weaknesses and mistakes. These examples from the near and distant past demonstrate that Trump is not an aberration in American foreign policy history. That's one very important conclusion. In what ways is Trump singular then? First, importantly, Nixon and Bush Jr. were both globalists, while Trump is fundamentally committed more than any president since 1928 to a nationalist, isolationist agenda. Second, Trump displays a mercurial decision-making style. Colonel House's remark about Lloyd George comes to mind here. Quote, "A mischief maker changing his mind like a weathercock." As part of this tendency, he replaced foreign policy appointments at cutthroat pace. Third, both Nixon and Bush Jr. appointed intellectually formidable assistants who were well-versed in world politics. Trump, on the other hand, appointed assistants notable for their servility, who were amateurish in foreign policy, and yet deliberate in their commitment to confront the civil service. Fourth, during his first term, Trump took the unilateral and anti-establishment strand to the extreme. 3 examples suffice. Conducting the key diplomatic game versus North Korea without appointing an ambassador to South Korea for a year and a half. Ordering those responsible for training new foreign service officers to totally erase the Obama years from official memory. And when discussing the issue of Russian intervention in the 2016 elections, publicly chastising CIA officers, telling them in Putin's presence that he trusted Putin more on this matter than his intelligence community. What does all this entail for the future? During his first term, Trump walked up to the line of undercutting international democratic and liberal institutions and norms. Obviously having grandiose feelings about himself and wishing to leave his personal imprint on this period in American history, Trump now feels both vindicated and unleashed. With the doctrine of presidential impunity promoted by the Supreme Court and Congress dominated by Republicans, it is difficult to foresee effective curbing of Trump's lust for absolute power, although his innate unpredictability must also be considered. Moreover, in terms of the decision-making process, his list of nominations in the foreign policy realm sends a menacing message, having as a common denominator the desire to, quote, traumatize the civil service, unquote, in the words of one close Trump confidant. A worst-case scenario might hence see a sharp turn against the alliances that came after World War II, a sharp turn against immigration, and trade wars against friends and foes alike. An already destabilized world will be further shaken by Trump too, and none of us can say with any certainty where this might all lead. Thanks.
Now I have to do something more optimistic, I guess.
Not easy.
I'll try. Okay, thank you all. Yeah, I don't know, maybe you should just turn it on. I'd rather see the people. This is just to try to discipline me since I don't do the 12 minutes well, but I will try, okay. And if I cheat, no one can tell. Everyone was cheating here, that's why we have a short discussion. Okay, so thanks again for coming. I think we have a really good build-up from the domestic level to the foreign policy level that Noam talked about. I'll stand, I guess. And now I'm trying to move even broader to look at this fuzzy thing we call international order, and basically to try to, I mean, people are talking a lot about this. Most of the discussion that I've heard is extremely pessimistic and worried. And without belittling this at all, I want to try to bring a few points to the table just to think about as we, after tonight, to see how bad this really is for international order. So the first point I want to make is that we talk a lot about the negative impact of Trump on the future of international order, but many people are talking about the liberal international order, and we need to remember that international order is a much broader thing, and it's not always the liberal international order. So for the IR students here who studied the English school and Hedley Bull, I think this should sound more familiar. But when we're talking about the liberal international order, it's an order that has a set of values supposedly holding it together. So it's the things that have been mentioned here before already about the importance of multilateralism, the importance of centrality of international institutions, universal human rights, liberal democracy as the preferred form of domestic government. And that's a pretty sort of thick version of an international order. But if we go back to Hedley Bull, English school, who spoke a lot about international order, there's actually a much thinner sort of version of international order that is based on a much more narrow set of key values, focusing on the importance of protecting the society of states, that is, the state as the central actor in the international system. States understand that they share this common goal of protecting the state system. They understand that they share a common goal of preserving peace, but also preserving the independence of individual states. And they are also interested, but to a lower extent, in promoting these basic goals of human society. So that would be like all the other things. And I guess the main point I want to make is that Trump may be bad for the liberal international order, but not as bad for a thinner version of an international order. And it's a scale, it's not an either or. And I think it's pretty clear when we look at what happened before Trump that the liberal international order is not that orderly and that there are a lot of internal tensions there. Some of them I think Daniel will talk about afterwards. So the pressure on the liberal international order came way before Trump, whether it's the rise of these illiberal powers like China or Russia, the sort of skeptical so-called global south about whether this is actually the order they want to be a part of, and of course all the domestic issues that already came up here and will be more prominent, I think, in Daniel's talk in a second. So there's a real pressure on the liberal international order way before Trump. So we know that Trump is trouble for the liberal international order, and everyone talks about this, so there's little new to say here. We know he has very little respect for the principle of multilateralism. It's not even respect. He thinks it's very problematic. And then Noam spoke a lot about the unilateral trend in American foreign policy. We know he has very little respect for issues related to liberal democracy, universal human rights, and even more so, I think, to the responsibility of the U.S. to actually protect them. So even if he has nothing against them, it's not the role of the U.S. to actually protect these things. So we know it's bad news for a liberal international order for various reasons we can elaborate later. But at the same time, I think there's too many actors have too much at stake in the international order, in some version between the thick and the thin one, to make it, I think, very resilient. On the one hand, if we look at the American side and the U.S. under Trump, the U.S. under Trump as well, if he wants to make America great again, is still also has very high stake, I think, in the international order. Sorry for the HST there, the hegemonic stability theory. We know from basic theory about hegemonic stability that if you are the most powerful actor, you have a clear stake in the health and the stability of the system. You can use it for your own good to make yourself great again. You can abuse it if you want, but no one else can provide this instead of you. So the U.S. is sort of structurally, I think, stuck there. Now, it has been mentioned here several times that Trump is not an ideologist. And people talk about his transactional approach. And that has its downsides if you're really stuck on the liberal international order. But it has some advantages if we're trying to think about a functioning international order altogether. Because what Trump is really upset about is not the idea of multilateralism. It's about this institutional bargain that is inherently asymmetric, unfair for the U.S., and therefore not making it possible for the U.S. to become great again. So if the problem is just with the institutional order and you can bargain your way through this. And I think Trump is ready to do is ready to do that. I think China is a very good example of this, because on the one hand we see these very sort of grave threats about what's going to happen with China and how worse things are going to get, these trade wars and everything. And at the same time, we hear him saying that he wants to invite Xi for a summit within the first 100 days of his presidency. So I think there's this flexibility here that the fact that it's not an ideologically driven policy that actually can also be a sign of hope if we want, for example, a US-China grand bargain to come into being. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I think this is probably might be easier under Trump because there's no the ideological element of China as representing this opposite to the liberal international order. It's just not an element there. If we move to the other side, because the international order is not only about the US, and we can talk about how crucial the US is to this whole story, if we're just blowing this up or not. If you look at the other major actors in the international system, they all have very high stakes in maintaining this order. So we have on the one hand the Europeans, who are, I think, I would still say the last bastion of the liberal international order, given all the domestic problems that Daniel will mention in a few minutes. But I think in terms of the idea, the Europeans, the EU is there. Clearly, they're very concerned about Trump, and you can ask afterwards about Greenland or whatever, okay? But I think the point is that they're also very realistic. They've been accustomed to dealing with these asymmetric relations with the US over the years, and they will manage. They'll open the checkbook, and they'll find ways to make new deals with Trump and work through the system, I think. The other side of the story is the big story is of course China, and we know that China has been trying to challenge the international liberal order for a very long time now, but I think that they really want to reform the system, not to get rid of it, because China has a built-in very high stake in an operating international order for its economic goods. And I want to sort of tap onto what Matthew said at the end. It's the economy, and I think a lot of it is really the story of the economy. The other interesting thing I want to say about China is that one of the Chinese critiques of the liberal international order actually echoes things that Trump will agree with. They want to go back to putting the nation state as the central actor, a sovereign state that can cooperate with other states. They have a vision of harmony, of international cooperation of sovereign states that is moderated through these international institutions that can help facilitate cooperation. So they're working through these institutions, but they're not subsumed by these institutions. And I think that's a vision that actually Trump can live pretty well with. So there's some actually common interest there. Okay. So given this, how we think about international order, and given the fact that I think the Americans on the one hand and others actually also want to maintain that order, I have a few preliminary conclusions is the wrong word, so I just wrote thoughts. First of all, there's this question of whether the U.S. if the U.S. is a hegemon or not for 12 minutes, but if the U.S., if a hegemonic state is really necessary to maintain this system, I would carefully suggest that, EU, China, emerging markets like India that all have a stake in the system can actually just upgrade their role to maintain the system. And I'm thinking a lot about the economic role. So when the US misbehaves, unquote, other actors become these more responsible adults. You can see this in families. You could see this when the US got off the gold standard and the system somehow survived also. So we want to look at these other actors as providers of international order. And the second thing goes to things that Noam said about this unilateral versus isolationist sort of tendency in American foreign policy. And I think, despite what you said about Trump having this isolationist sort of vision, I don't think the US will go isolationist. And I think this is largely due to these very powerful systemic dynamics, which is why I'm in IR. And just to put them on the table in my 2 minutes left, first is the issue of the geopolitical rivalry with China, which is clearly they're not a new thing. Apparently sort of seems like it's higher now. I think the geopolitical rivalry with China has two implications. One is that you will see more competition in these institutions. A lot of, the idea of working through these institutions is to promote these positive sum gains, not like a zero-sum approach. You will see more sort of zero-sum competition within these institutions, which is not good for how institutions operate. But at the same time, I think it means that the US can't abandon these institutions. If you abandon them, because the Chinese have a stake in these institutions, abandoning them is not an option. The US tried to do that in some institutions in East Asia, and the Chinese basically just took over. So they're stuck there, and they have to sort of work through in these institutions. That's how, at least I see it. Secondly, I think because the EU powers and states like India don't really want Chinese alternative. They have their concerns about this China-led international order. They will do a lot of hedging between China and the US, and they will make sure that the US sort of stays in and does not decouple. So there's a supply-demand sort of pressures here to stay involved. And finally, Trump might, circumvent a lot of these institutional challenge to cut these direct deals because he really doesn't want to work through the WTO to deal with China, right? He wants to invite Xi and have a good dinner with him and cut a deal. And that's probably something that's going to happen. But after that happens, I think the subsequent sort of management of the relationship will go back to the institution. So they're much more resilient, I think, than they appear. So I will stop there. I will not talk about Trump and illiberal peace, because that's like another thing you can ask. And I can't believe I was the most disciplined speaker in this panel so far. So this is big international order, and now we're moving on to Daniel, who I think through populism sort of brings together the domestic and the international very nicely to sort of conclude our thoughts, our brilliant thoughts, yes.
Your position in the obstructionist panel caused discipline to descend on you as a result on the U.S. and its
Yep.
system.
לא, רק לשים את המצגת. Okay. When I was invited by Galia and I understood who is coming, I said, well, you are confused. You are inviting Americans, but I'm from the wrong America. So you are all North Americans.
I was waiting for you to say something when they talked about America and not the United States.
This was my way of saying it. But on the other hand, you asked me to try to think about what we should expect from Trump and Trumpism about foreign policy, about international politics, about the challenge or not to the international order, through the perspective of populism. And I think I can contribute a bit from this. My reservation, I'm not an expert, not only on American politics, I'm not an expert also on Trump and Trumpism as foreign policy, so I will try to present a chapter or some ideas of the chapter and building on those ideas to make my own arguments. So building on theory, let's say, about populist foreign policy and the case of Trump in the first government to try to think what can we expect for the second one, and even perhaps trying to enter into this issue of not only foreign policy but also international security, even international conflicts. Also some students from the course of international conflict resolution are here. Okay, so you said Noam singular, Trump is singular, and it's a huge discussion we have about is Trump, in fact, and Trumpism sui generis. Okay, so that's a huge question, I would say. For example, Ron Krebs used to say that. But Trump is, is sui generis. But I can think that was my response to Ron and others. But also Bolsonaro was pretty much sui generis. And also Milei, if you see in Argentina, was pretty much sui generis. And Chavez, in a way, was very much sui generis. And I can think about other people even here in the Middle East, that they are very much sui generis in terms of some particularities as populists that make us think whether are they really populist. And also regarding this, I mean, you wrote, Charlie, the thick ideology, right? The conservatism, etc. And we can think about a lot of populists, let's say the thin ideology, with different thick ideology. So a lot of questions regarding who is sui generis or not. So let's say that in a way, Trump, this is the way I will analyze it, it's part of a global, a broader, phenomenon of global populism, transnational populism. We will try to develop these categories. Okay? So what we can say about populism, we see, I mean, all the data sets from different perspectives about populism see a rise of global populism. That rise, it's not only about the fact that they come to different places in the world, but also that they come to power. Okay, that's the real difference in the last, I would say, a decade and a half from previous decades in the 50s, 60s, 70s around the world. There was populism, but perhaps not in power, perhaps only in Latin America and other places in Eastern Europe we can discuss. So, trying to also refer to this issue of, okay, what we expected from Trump before his first government to be a Jacksonian, a typical Jacksonian as you presented. Okay, so as isolationist, for example. Okay, question, nationalistics, in Europe, Eurosceptics, try to think about the rise of populism. It's about Brexit, right? It was about Brexit. So this was what we expected, in fact, from populists in doing, or in molding, or in formulating their foreign policies, right? But we know from the last years, and in fact from the laboratory of populism that it's in Latin America, we know that that's much different, or at least much complex. Yes, we see isolationism. Yes, we see protectionism. Yes, we see different kind of inward-looking nationalism. But we also see alliances, associations, solidarity, transnational ties. So how to explain this? So when we refer to, let's call it transnational populism, that means it crosses borders, crosses national borders. On the one hand, we need to understand that we are speaking about populism. And if we want to search for a sort of consensual definition, we can discuss if it's part of a thin ideology, a strategy, a style, a discourse, a policy. There are different schools, like call it, but all agree that it's something about people versus elites. It's about we, the populists, are the people. We are the will of the people. We represent the will of the people against the will of the elites. And this action is the populist action, antagonizing, polarizing between that people and that elite. And we can discuss this a lot, but I will not enter into theory if you want. Okay? But the second thing, that's the transnational element. Some would say it's an international element sometimes, not a transnational. Some would say it's a global element. It's about this way out. The fact that populists go abroad with their strategies. These people and these elites are not only at home. This is not only a domestic strategy or a discourse or ideology or style, but something that cross borders. The people, the elites are today inherently transnational. Try to think about who are the elites today that we accuse. Okay, it could IMF, the European Union, the UN, or different bodies, transnational groups, the Jews, for example. So we can think about a lot of elites that are attacked, and the people should be constructed transnationally. And this is the idea of transnational populism. I call it the populist way out, the need to go abroad and search for this legitimation that they do not find at home. So contemporary populists transfer domestic strategies, that means populism, to the regional and global arena, aiming to leverage both local and international legitimacy. So this is, in a way, my theoretical framework to try to look into Trump, and as I will say, this is from an edited volume of the last year, and I will be focusing, and what we do in this volume is trying to search in different regions what are the main particularities or populist foreign policies. Okay, and the second question is, what are the constraints and the catalyst of that populist foreign policy? And I'm basing my analysis on the chapter of George Loeffelman, Amy Skonieczny, and Rubrik Bigon, that they looked at North American populism. That's in a way it was, I mean, not Mexico, if we consider Mexico part of North America, geographically speaking. About the US. And they call it the Trump shock. And we need to understand this, how they analyze the first administration of Trump regarding, and Trump and Trumpism regarding foreign policy. They said it was a sort of shock treatment. To whom? To the diplomatic establishment, foreign policy in general, and what they show is something pretty similar to what you presented, Noam, about something erratic, something radical moves, transgression, people call it transgressional foreign policy, Daniel Drezner called it angry populist. This idea that you create a shock on the establishment and you change all the time. But on the other hand, if we look at what were the real, policy shift or the critical junctures in terms of foreign policy, try to hear how this is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, exciting the JCPOA, announcing the US withdrawal from the World Health Organization, reducing US aid, declaring Jerusalem and the Golan Heights as part of Israel, the photo op with Kim Jong-un. So some people would say that those are essentially declarative moves. So on the one hand, yes, a shock, that action, but on the other hand, not necessarily huge shifts in terms of substantial foreign policy. Yes, still, they influence, and they influence in terms of the diffusion of populism. So after Trump, we saw a lot more cases all around the world, including here in Israel, not necessarily from the right wing, also from the left wing populists imitating right wing populists, for example, in Trump. And I can remember some examples from all around the world, from the right and from the left. So a lot about the style, the discourse, the strategy was adopted by different candidates in the world. And the second thing, the encounter. Those transnational encounters, we can see these days now with Milei from Argentina in the US. All the populists that went to the US now to receive, to congratulate Trump in his presidency, and the meetings and encounters, it's there. And we can think about different speeches from Trump, praising his friend or Viktor Orban from Hungary, etc., etc. So you see there, but not necessarily two great states, and perhaps not about national interest, it's about the people interest, right? The people, the leaders' interest. And the second, perhaps the influence on the contestation of the liberal international order. This contestation of the main institutions, a la bull, institutions of the liberal international order, and we can discuss this. So, but instead of taking it there, I think, Galia, you did fine, and I agree. I will try to think about how we can understand this Trump's populist foreign policy dichotomy. On the one hand, the shock, the radical, the erratic. On the other hand, the dogs that bark but do not bite logic, right? So you do a lot, you bark, but not necessarily you bite. And this is a sort of pattern that we see a lot in populist foreign policy, in particular when it's about security things. So one explanation could be brought through, what they see here, that in fact a lot of the patterns of these declarative things go about what we know about how populists do foreign policy. The politicization of the issues, a lot of these changes that I talked, those were not in the political agenda before Trump. In the moment they put it in the agenda, so it was those issues were discussed. The second thing, the personalization. So Trump as diplomat in chief, he or his people, his family, and so perhaps this is connected. And the third thing is about decentralization. Even in the United States, we saw a lot of marginalization of experts, marginalization of the U.S. State Secretary of State, Pentagon, etc. So my people around me for decision making. So this could be part of, okay, in fact, he follows the pattern. I think the most interesting one, and I'm not building on it now, is to try to say, I think there's a huge contradiction, structural contradiction between the two slogans of Trump regarding foreign policy. One is America First. That's the main slogan regarding what we expect from Trump. And the second one is Make America Great Again. And I think this is about substance. This is not about the style. So if you want America First, that means you put the US citizens first. In a way, this brings you to isolationism or protectionism in some elements. But if you want to make America great again, obviously make North America great again, in this sense, all people saying make Spain great again, make Israel great again, etc., you should, when it was great, right? I mean, when Spain, when they were great, in 500 years ago, they would say, or 400 years ago. So you need to go to that, the golden ages, right? For Russia, it's perhaps the Tsar. For Israel, it's a good question, right? To David's king or to Solomon, etc., etc. So I think that means being in a way imperialistic, perhaps. That means exporting your revolution outside. So it's, in a way, it's some sort of contradiction. And you need to, when you go and you do foreign policy, not when you talk, you can embrace everything. But when you need to mold your foreign policy, then you need to make decisions. And I think this is what happened to Trump at the first government. And the third one, I would say, it's about the check and balances of the U.S. political system. When we see in the government in the book, a lot of constraints and catalysts of populist foreign policy. In the U.S. case, it's the typical case of how the domestic political system, the lack of authoritarian tradition, at least in the 150 years ago, and we can discuss whether there were some, perhaps Roosevelt in a way, the first Roosevelt, I mean, presidentialism in this sense, the party dynamics, two strong parties. So in a way, the system controlled also strong institutions, right? State Department, Pentagon. In a way, you are constrained for your own foreign policy. And why this is important, and I know that I'm on time, for the discussion of what to expect from Trump 2.0. Why? Because we know that where is Maor? We are working on the on the populist comeback, right? And discussing what happened, like with Perón when he returned, with Chavez when he returned, with Putin when he returned, with Erdogan in a way when he returned. So we can expect from populists that when they return, and even the more they are in power, and this is an argument we are bringing, the more they are in power, they are not only becoming more authoritarian, but perhaps also more revisionists. And this is a huge question, in particular looking at what's happening in Russia after 2014 and 2022 in particular. So what we are seeing from Trump now, or before, not now, in Gaza, but declaring something about Greenland and something about Panama, about perhaps even Ukraine in a way, about the Middle East, question mark. So are we expecting a more revisionist foreign policy, international security policy from Trump? That's a huge question. And the second one is this combination. The more Trump will become more authoritarian, and it's a huge question mark. I'm not saying it will happen, but we also have some hints from how he ended his last government. So we should expect more revisionist elements in foreign policy, including in security policies. And they have a question what to expect about Israel, but this is perhaps for your own questions. So I'm looking forward. I don't know if we will have discussions, but it is a pleasure for me to try to contribute to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Because we were so disciplined, we only have 6 minutes to raise questions. First, I want to thank all the panelists. I think there is so much we can do. We should look, of course.
Yes.
Because there are so many big questions here, also about the interaction between the domestic level and the international level, beyond all the the international debates among themselves. So there's a lot to say here. But let's just open this up and we'll collect a few brief questions. I apologize. You can say wonderful questions and finish the soup and go home. And we'll try to somehow, at least collect the thoughts, okay? So I'll start with the students, okay? So yes, please just present yourself.
I'm Elinor. I'm in Charlie's class here, and I'm in political science and economics. With the inclusion of kind of the tech oligarchic right and more brown people in the Trump coalition, doesn't that kind of move away from the nativist, mercantilist kind of policies that he kind of ran on? He won on different things than he ran on, and so isn't that going to change?
Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm shy. I'm in Noam's class, Gulliver's Troubles. I have to excuse a bad cold, a congested voice. My question is primarily for Noam, and also it's a bit related to what Galia said. Both, Noam more so, you seem very pessimistic towards Trump's future term in terms for global stability, right?
Oh,
That's the question?
No, I just want to make sure I get your point.
Yes, with a reservation.
Okay. Because I want to...
Meaning, I don't know if you're familiar with Benny Miller's idea of illiberal peace. I think he has a point there. I mean, we must remember that sometimes, being deterred by the bullying world really works, and we've seen that already in our region. And I think this can function more under Trump than under previous administrations. So that's my reservation.
Because I just wanted to compare it to what we've seen during the Biden administration with a multitude of wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, and you can see advances from China, I guess. We also look at the
Biden administration wasn't fearful enough.
Mm-hmm.
The Biden
Okay, so let's just add
administration
a
wasn't
last
fearful.
question. Okay. Yes, and it's Alfred.
I will revert very quickly. Question to the panel. Populism in foreign policy is not just gesticulation, because if you say the problems are the other, it's very good, but then are you going to declare war to them? The only ones that could say that for any problem they have out to deflect is the United States. That's why I am asking this. In the case of the United States, is it just gesticulation, like in the case of Spain, Chile, whatever, or not? And why I'm saying this is because you said, Eric, it's the economy, stupid. People don't want wars. I mean, people, the ones that draw populism, they don't want war. They want to have a good life, and therefore Trump is in a quandary. I mean, if he says I'm going to go to war, so I think my own diagnosis, the conclusion is that the real victims of the new foreign policy of Trump will be international law, international organizations, because they are weak. So he can make war on them, and nobody will say anything.
I agree.
And let me just give a 20-second answer to
So-
everyone. So, there
We're
are,
doing, okay,
Yeah.
just to clarify, we're not gonna keep you here for, beyond the legal time, and we're happy to talk to you afterwards, okay? So we can do the, 20 seconds is good.
Yeah,
Since we started, yeah.
so,
You want to stand on one foot also?
of course, yes, yes, yes. So, there are plenty of Hispanic Americans who have been in the U.S. for 3 or more generations, and there are plenty of Asian Americans who have been in the U.S. for several generations. So to think that immigrants is always